All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today we're taking a deep dive into the life of Malcolm X and our main source, his autobiography.
Oh, fantastic choice, really. I mean, you get that firsthand perspective, raw, unfiltered.
Exactly. And we're not just hitting the bullet points of his life here. We're trying to understand what shaped him, what drove this troubled kid to become such a powerful voice.
Well, and the book doesn't pull any punches. It really dives deep into how those early experiences with racism, I mean, we're talking childhood here, really impacted him.
And it's more than just, a few bad encounters, right?
Yeah.
The autobiography really paints this picture of constant, I don't know, almost like a chipping away at his sense of self.
Yeah, like almost setting the stage for him embracing the Nation of Islam later on, that whole idea of black superiority. It's almost like a counterpunch to the racism he faced, a way to reclaim his identity.
It's that need for belonging too, isn't it? You see it first in foster care. He's acing school, but feeling totally out of place with white society.
And then later, that drift into the criminal world in Boston. Like he's searching for somewhere, anywhere to have control, even if it means breaking the law.
And it's not just teenage rebellion, is it? There are some sources you gave me that suggest he was almost, I don't know, calculated in his approach, like he's testing the limits of a system he already sees as broken.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about selling marijuana, running numbers, even looks up to some of the more, shall we say, seasoned criminals he's running with, sees them as defiant, rejecting the rules that society's trying to impose on him.
And you can almost see that defiance, that willingness to operate outside the lines
Okay.
as a stepping stone to his later work.
It's where he builds those skills, right? Self-reliance, persuasion, leadership, makes those connections that'll be crucial later on.
It's funny, even in those criminal activities, you can see glimmers of the leadership that makes him such a force in the Nation of Islam later on. There's a charisma, a strategic mind, even then.
He calls himself Detroit Red during that time, almost shedding his old identity, right? Creating this new persona, rebellious, almost, I don't know, glamorous even.
But then comes the arrest, imprisonment. Everyone talks about it as this turning point, but I think we need to look deeper than just the redemption narrative, right?
Right, because the sources you've pulled really highlight how psychologically jarring that experience was. He's stripped of everything, forced to confront himself. Like, prison created this space for real, deep introspection.
And it's in that space that he encounters the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam.
Now, remember, we've got sources here from both sides, right?
Yeah.
Supporters and critics of the nation. And what they both show is how powerfully the nation challenged the racial narrative of the time.
For Malcolm X, this message of black empowerment, self-reliance, separation from white society, I mean, it must have been incredibly potent after what he'd been through. He'd already seen firsthand how the system was stacked against him.
Absolutely. This wasn't just about converting to a religion. It was like finding a whole new framework for understanding the world. Suddenly, his anger, his experiences, they made sense.
And he didn't just dip his toes in, right?
Yeah.
He devoured those teachings. Books, self-education. He comes out of prison a changed man.
And that transformation, that dedication to learning, it explains his meteoric rise in the nation, doesn't it? He wasn't just charismatic, he was a brilliant orator, a skilled debater. He could articulate the nation's message with real power.
And those speeches, wow, they were drawing huge crowds. His condemnation of white supremacy was so direct, so unapologetic.
And even the ones that drew criticism, for being inflammatory, if you look closer, they show a deep understanding of history, politics, the whole picture. He was making connections that resonated with people.
But his rise didn't come without pushback. Media scrutiny, white supremacists, even some within the civil rights movement, saw his message as too divisive.
His relationship with, say, Dr. King was really complicated, wasn't it? Two sides of the same coin, King pushing for integration, Malcolm X for separation.
And then as Malcolm X's views evolved, he started questioning some of the nation's core doctrines, especially after his trip to Mecca. Seeing Muslims of all races praying together, it really challenged the idea of black superiority.
That's where we'll pick up next time, right? Exploring those events and ideas that led to his break with the nation, his evolving views on race, religion, everything. So we left off with Malcolm X's trip to Mecca, which was, really a turning point for him. Talk about a life-changing experience.
Yeah, in his autobiography, he talks about being blown away by, The sheer diversity,
Hmm.
seeing Muslims of all races, all backgrounds, praying together, it really challenged that whole idea of black separatism, didn't it?
Totally. And it wasn't just about seeing it, it was about experiencing it. He writes about white Muslims treating him with, genuine respect and kindness. So different from what he was used to growing up. It forced him to confront his own preconceived notions about race.
It really shook him, you can tell. He goes through this period of deep introspection, starts reevaluating everything he thought he knew.
And he talks about feeling this like weight lifted off him, almost like he was shedding the anger, the resentment that had fueled his earlier activism.
It's almost like that shedding of anger opened him up to new ways of thinking about the fight for racial justice. He starts to see the limitations of just separating, realizes that true equality means changing the whole power structure, dismantling the systems that keep racism alive.
Exactly. And that realization leads him to, well, a pretty huge step, right? Breaking away from the Nation of Islam.
Which was, let's be honest, a risky move.
Yep.
He was stepping outside that structure, making himself a target.
He knew the risks. Oh, yeah. Threats, attempts to silence him, constant danger. But he felt like he had no choice. Like this new understanding of Islam, of racial justice, demanded a different path.
And that path led him to create his own organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, more inclusive, more international in its approach to racial justice, bringing in ideas like Pan-Africanism, human rights, self-determination.
This is where all those sources you provided on Pan-Africanism really come into play. Malcolm X started seeing the struggle in America as part of this global movement, right? Decolonization, self-determination, it was all connected.
He saw these parallels between struggles against colonialism, imperialism, racial injustice, argued that you couldn't separate them, that true liberation meant dismantling the whole global power structure.
It's amazing how his speeches from this period reflect that shift, that broader vision. He's not just focused on Black America anymore. He's talking about the third world, about people of color all over the world who've been exploited and dominated.
He goes from black separatism to global solidarity. It's a huge evolution in his thinking. And it's not just about race anymore, right? It's about power, identity, the whole interconnectedness of it all.
He starts using the language of human rights, arguing that denying basic human dignity, that's not just a Black problem in America, it's a universal problem.
And his critique of capitalism sharpens during this period. He sees exploitation of workers, wealth concentrated in the hands of the few, these global inequalities created by capitalism.
Yeah.
To him, these are huge barriers to real justice, real liberation.
And that critique, that willingness to challenge the whole economic system, it set him apart from a lot of people in the civil rights movement even. They were focused on integration, working within the existing system.
Malcolm X was calling for something much more radical, right?
Security.
A complete transformation of society, a dismantling of those systems, a redistribution of power and resources.
And unsurprisingly, that put him at odds with a lot of people. White supremacists, obviously, but also some of the more moderate voices within the civil rights movement. He was seen as too extreme, too confrontational.
But his message, it resonated with a lot of young activists, especially. They were tired of waiting for change, tired of seeing poverty and discrimination persist.
And as his influence grew, so did the danger. He knew he was a target, that his words were making powerful enemies.
He was living under constant threat, surveillance, death threats. But he never backed down, never stopped speaking out against injustice.
That takes courage to live like that. He even said once, "I live like a man who is already dead." Powerful stuff. But he believed in what he was fighting for, that it was worth risking his life for.
And that commitment, that fearlessness, it's part of what makes his story so inspiring, isn't it? He reminds us to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous.
Absolutely. His life was a testament to the power of speaking truth to power, of fighting for what's right, no matter the cost.
So in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore his legacy, the impact he had on the struggle for racial justice, and how his message continues to resonate with us today. It's hard to believe it's been, almost 60 years since Malcolm X was assassinated? But his ideas, his impact, they're still felt today.
Oh, absolutely. And you can really see that in the sources you pulled together, how differently people interpret his legacy.
Yeah, for some, he's that symbol of Black militancy. Focus on the early stuff, separatism, that direct confrontation of white supremacy.
Right, but others see a much more complex figure. The later Malcolm X, embracing human rights, Pan-Africanism, global solidarity.
I think what strikes me is how even his most controversial statements, they still spark debate. They get people thinking. He never shied away from those tough conversations about race and power.
He wouldn't let people be comfortable, would he? That willingness to speak truth to power, even when it made him unpopular, it's a big part of why he's still relevant. He makes us look inward, examine our own biases, confront the ugly parts of our society.
One theme that comes up a lot in these sources is self-reliance, especially economic empowerment. Malcolm X believed that true liberation, it wasn't just about legal equality, right?
Yeah, he pushed for building independent institutions, creating opportunities within Black communities, that sense of ownership.
He saw the limits of relying on white institutions for progress. True power came from controlling your own destiny, building businesses, supporting each other.
A self-sustaining system, right? To counter those forces that kept Black communities down.
And it's a message that's so relevant today, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're still dealing with the legacy of redlining, the racial wealth gap. Malcolm X's vision reminds us that true equality goes beyond just having the same rights on paper.
It's about access, opportunity, the ability to build a future for yourself. And that's a call to action for all of us, isn't it? Invest in those communities, support those businesses, fight those systems that create inequality.
And then there's his emphasis on Pan-Africanism, that global solidarity. He realized the struggle here in America is part of something much bigger, connected to colonialism, imperialism, exploitation happening all over the world.
His trips to Africa, meeting those leaders, it really opened his eyes to the global context of racial injustice.
And that push for unity, for people of African descent to stand together, it feels even more relevant now, doesn't it? In a world that's so interconnected, the legacies of colonialism are still shaping things. The fight for justice crosses borders.
It's a reminder that we need to work together, learn from each other, build those bridges, so that everyone, regardless of where they come from, can have dignity, freedom, opportunity.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Malcolm X's life, it's amazing how much his words still resonate. Whether you agree with him or not, he makes you think, he makes you question.
He was always evolving, always challenging himself, and pushing everyone around him to do the same. His voice was so powerful, and it still inspires us to fight for a better world.
So what do you think? What sticks with you after exploring Malcolm X's story?
I think for me, it's that constant self-reflection, challenging your own assumptions, being open to new ideas, willing to grow. Malcolm X's life was all about transformation, and it pushes us to do the same.
He shows us that fighting for justice, it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? It takes dedication, commitment, and a willingness to challenge those systems of inequality, no matter how ingrained they are.
And maybe most importantly, he gives us hope. Even when things seem impossible, he believed that change could happen. And his life, it's proof that we can make a difference, that collective action has power.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to continue exploring Malcolm X's work, to grapple with his ideas, and to find your own inspiration in his unwavering fight for justice and equality. His story is a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect.
Absolutely. His legacy challenges us to act, to push for that more just and equitable world. And as we move forward, let's keep his words in mind, by any means necessary.